The house was finished before the world was ready to keep it. Mar-A-Lago stood sealed between ocean and lake, perfectly maintained, long after its purpose had quietly expired. The marble floors were cleaned, the lights still turned on. Nothing was broken, no one lived there, no one needed it. When the estate was finally offered to the United States government, it was not rejected with outrage or debate. It was declined with paperwork, the doors closed without ceremony. What remained was not ruin, it was something more unsettling, a legacy that outlived its reason to exist. In the early 20th century, there were American fortunes that did not need to prove themselves. They were already accepted, already integrated into the system. Money arrived quietly, through dividends and trusts, without spectacle. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born into one of those fortunes. By adulthood, the scale of her wealth was beyond comparison, but the culture around it was restrained. This was old money logic. Wealth was not a performance. It was a structure, something meant to stabilize power, not display it. Palm Beach became a seasonal refuge for that class, not because it was fashionable, but because it was distant. A controlled environment, far from scrutiny, where influence could exist without explanation. Mar-A-Lago entered this world quietly. It was not introduced as a spectacle or advertised as a landmark. It appeared as an assumption, large enough to matter, formal enough to endure. Positioned deliberately between ocean and lake, separated from the ordinary rhythms of the town. At the time, its significance did not need to be explained. Those who mattered understood what it represented. The underlying belief was simple. If wealth was designed carefully enough, it would carry its purpose forward on its own. That belief had not yet been tested.
The house was not built as a retreat. It was built as a statement. For Marjorie Merriweather Post, permanence was not abstract. It could be designed, measured, reinforced with stone, symmetry, and ceremony. The belief was simple. If something looked permanent, it could become permanent. Mar-A-Lago was shaped around that belief. Its scale was deliberate. Too large for a single family. Too formal for private comfort. Every choice suggested continuity rather than intimacy. This was a place meant to host, to receive, to endure. The promise behind it was never written down, but it was clear enough. Wealth, when properly organized, could anchor power. Architecture could hold meaning in place, even as people changed. There was also an assumption embedded in the design, that the future would resemble the past closely enough to recognize what had been built for it. That institutions would still value formality. That authority would still arrive quietly, dressed in restraint. This was not naivete, it was confidence. Old money had survived wars, depressions, and political shifts. There was no reason to believe it would not survive this century as well. So the house was finished without contingency. No alternative use, no exit plan. No thought of what would happen if the promise failed. Mar-A-Lago did not prepare for rejection. It assumed recognition. That assumption would hold briefly. The break did not arrive as a scandal. There was no collapse, no sudden loss, no dramatic turning point. It arrived as a calculation. By the late 20th century, the numbers no longer aligned with the assumptions the house had been built on. Maintenance alone required a scale of spending that no longer translated into influence. The rituals Mar-A-Lago was designed for had fewer participants. Authority had begun to move faster, speak louder, and travel lighter. When the estate was formally offered to the United States government, it carried an unspoken expectation that history would recognize the gesture, that institutions would step into the role the house had been waiting for. Instead, the response was procedural. The cost of upkeep outweighed the symbolic value. The logistics were impractical. The era of formal seasonal power had passed. There was no public rejection, no argument over meaning, just a quiet return of the property. In the records, the moment is thin, a decision summarized in brief language, a transfer reversed, no commentary attached. This was the only crack that mattered, not because the house was refused, but because nothing replaced the purpose it had been built to serve. Mar-A-Lago remained intact, but unassigned, preserved, but unresolved. What failed was not the building. It was the assumption that permanence could be inherited automatically, and once that assumption broke, it did not need to break again. After that, the record slows down. The house stayed open, but not in the way it once had. Staff remained, Repairs continued. The gardens were trimmed on schedule. From the outside, nothing suggested decline. There were no boarded windows, no visible neglect. Maintenance replaced meaning. Inside, the rooms were still arranged for arrivals that no longer came. The dining tables remained large. The corridors remained ceremonial. There are few details from this period that explain what the house was for, only what it was no longer doing. No new role was announced. No transition was named. Mar-A-Lago existed in suspension, preserved without direction, waiting without expectation. This pause did not feel temporary. It felt unresolved. When institutions move on, they do not announce it. They simply stop returning.
And in that quiet interval, the house revealed something it had never needed to show before. Without recognition, even the most carefully built legacy becomes weight. When Mar-A-Lago reappeared, it did not return as a legacy. It returned as an asset. The shift was subtle but decisive. The house was no longer expected to symbolize continuity or restraint. It was asked to perform, to attract attention, to host visibility rather than authority. This was a different logic of power, not inherited, not stabilized by institutions, but activated through access and presence. Under Donald Trump, Mar-A-Lago did not pretend to be what it once was. It adapted. The scale remained, the formality remained, but the meaning changed. Where old money relied on being understood without explanation, this new use depended on being seen. The house became a backdrop rather than an anchor, a place where power gathered temporarily, not something meant to last quietly across generations. Mar-A-Lago survived by shedding the promise it was built to keep. And in doing so, it confirmed the quiet tragedy at the center of this story. The house endured, the idea behind it did not. Today, Mar-A-Lago still stands. The gates still close at night. The walls still hold. From a distance, it looks unchanged. But the world it was built to serve no longer exists. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not lose her fortune. She did not lose her status. What she lost was something harder to protect. The future she designed her wealth for never arrived. Mar-A-Lago was meant to anchor meaning in place. Instead, it learned to survive without it. And that is the quiet tragedy here. Not that the house failed, but that it succeeded in a different way. A legacy does not disappear when it is rejected. It disappears when it becomes unnecessary. There are other houses like this, other fortunes built with certainty, other promises waiting for a world willing to receive them. If you're interested in how power fades quietly, there's more to this story than fits here. And the question remains, when wealth no longer serves the public, what is it really for?